Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that's pretty fascinating, at least to me. We're going to be looking at buying and selling and leasing land and buildings, especially when it comes to the world of construction.
Yeah. It's an area where you really see how the law of contract and land law kind of come together.
Yeah, for sure. And I was looking through the sources you gave me, and there were some really interesting real-world examples that I can't wait to dig into a bit later. Things like the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and even something as simple as a homeowner needing permission just to build a garage on their own property.
Exactly. Those examples really highlight why it's so important to understand both those areas of law if you're involved in construction in any way. I mean, they work together to prevent legal problems and ensure that, transactions go smoothly.
Okay, so I think before we get into those specific cases, it would be helpful to get a quick overview of land law and contract law in general. Can you kind of give us the basics?
Sure. So land law, well, it basically deals with the rights and responsibilities that are tied to owning, using, and transferring land. Two really important concepts in land law are freehold and leasehold ownership.
Ah, okay, yeah. I saw those terms a lot in the research materials.
Yeah, freehold means you own the land and any buildings on it outright, while leasehold means you have a right to use the property, but only for a certain amount of time.
Gotcha. So that's the difference. Okay. So what about contract law? What are the key points there?
So, contract law is all about agreements. Basically, for a contract to be legally valid, you need a few essential ingredients. You need an offer and an intention to create legal relations, also something called capacity to contract. And then there's consideration and finally acceptance.
Okay, wow, there's a lot to it. Sounds a bit like baking a cake. You need all the right ingredients. What does all this have to do with buying or selling real estate, though?
Well, you can think about it like this. Let's say you're buying a house. So the seller, they offer a price and maybe some other terms and conditions. If you accept their offer, you're both showing that you intend to be legally bound by this agreement. You both need to be legally capable of entering into a contract, which is that capacity thing I mentioned. And there has to be an exchange of something valuable, which is usually money for the property. But once you both accept the terms, boom, you've got yourselves a legally enforceable contract.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like a legal checklist for a property deal. And if you miss an item, things can get messy.
You got it. Missing any of those ingredients could mean the contract isn't valid. And these principles apply to leases too, not just buying and selling.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these two areas of law, contract and land law, work together when you're dealing with property.
Yeah, they're really closely connected. You can't have one without the other.
Right. So speaking of steps in a process, your source material mentions something called planning permission. And there's even that example in there about you wanting to build a garage. Can you walk me through what that process looks like?
Sure. So planning permission is basically all about control. It's there to make sure that any development or building work aligns with the needs of the community and protects the environment.
So it's not just about what I want to do on my own land.
Right. It's about finding a balance between individual property rights and the needs of the wider community. It's about the bigger picture.
Okay. Is there like a specific law that covers this?
Yeah. The main one is called the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990. That's the key legislation in England and Wales, and it lays the foundation for how these planning decisions are made.
All right, so let's say I do want to build that garage. What would I need to do? What are the steps?
Okay, well, the first thing is to check whether your project falls under what are called permitted development rights. These are basically minor developments that are pre-approved, so you don't need formal planning permission for them.
Oh, I see. So like small extensions or loft conversions.
Yeah, exactly. Things like that. But if you're thinking about building a larger garage, you'd probably need to submit a formal planning application to your local authority. They would assess your proposal's impact on, well, on lots of things, actually. Things like traffic, your neighbors, the way the area looks, that sort of thing.
Wow, it's more involved than I thought. So what if they say no? What if they reject my application?
Well, you can appeal their decision. You'd appeal to something called the Planning Inspectorate, which is an independent body that reviews planning decisions.
Okay, so there's still hope. But I do remember that story from the materials about the couple who were forced to demolish their house.
Yeah.
They just skipped this whole process, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that case just highlights how important it is to understand planning permission. Building without the proper approvals can have really serious consequences, sometimes even leading to demolition, like you said.
Yikes. Okay, so planning permission is definitely no joke. Got it. So we've talked about that. Now, what about building control regulations? Are they the same thing?
No, they're different. Planning permission focuses more on the use of land. Building control regulations are all about the building itself, making sure that the building is safe, healthy, and meets certain standards.
So it's about making sure the actual construction is up to code.
Exactly. Building regulations cover a whole range of things, from fire safety and structural integrity to energy efficiency and accessibility.
And who actually checks that these regulations are being followed? Is it the same people who handle the planning permission?
Not necessarily. The UK has what's called a two-tier system. There's the local authority building control, and then there are also approved inspectors. You can choose either one to oversee your project.
Oh, okay. Interesting. But these regulations must be pretty detailed. How does anyone keep track of all of them?
Well, there are what are called approved documents. These offer practical guidance on how to comply with the building regulations. They're pretty user-friendly, and they cover different areas like fire safety, ventilation, drainage, things like that.
Okay, that sounds helpful. So speaking of fire safety, um, the materials you gave me mentioned the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and I was wondering, how did that event affect building regulations, if at all?
Oh, it had a huge impact. Grenfell was a devastating reminder of how important fire safety is, especially in high-rise buildings. After the tragedy, there were a lot of calls for stricter regulations and better enforcement, particularly when it comes to the materials used in construction.
And what about the consequences of not following the regulations? What happens then?
Well, if you don't comply, you could end up with enforcement notices, which would require you to make changes. In some cases, you could even face legal action.
Definitely not worth the risk. So we've covered planning permission and building control regulations, both of which are super important during construction. But what about the legal side of actually using a property, once it's built? How does the law come into play then?
Well, that's where something called occupier's liability comes in.
Occupier's liability. What's that?
It's basically about the responsibility that property owners or occupiers have to keep their property safe for anyone who comes onto it.
Okay, so if someone gets hurt on my property, am I responsible for that?
You could be, yes. You have what's called a duty of care to make sure your property is reasonably safe for visitors.
I see. And what about responsibility for, I don't know, what other people do on my property, like employees or contractors?
So that's where we get into something like vicarious liability.
Vicarious liability. Okay, another legal term.
Yeah, basically it means an employer can be held liable for the actions of their employees, but only if those actions happen during their employment. So for example, let's say you have a construction worker who accidentally damages a neighbor's property. Well, their employer could be held responsible for that damage.
So it's like a chain of responsibility then.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And it's really important to understand these principles, especially in construction, because you usually have so many different parties involved.
Okay, so we've talked about occupier's liability and vicarious liability, which are both about responsibility for people on the property. Your notes also mentioned trespass and nuisance in relation to construction. What do those terms refer to?
Okay, so trespass usually involves someone entering your property without permission. This could be someone like a person who enters a construction site without authorization, or it could even be something like construction materials encroaching onto a neighbor's property.
Oh, okay. So that would be things like a crane swinging over a boundary line or debris falling onto someone else's land?
Yeah, exactly. Nuisance is a bit broader. It covers situations where the construction activity causes unreasonable interference with a neighbor's enjoyment of their property.
So things like excessive noise, dust, or vibrations would fall under nuisance.
You got it.
And what can people do if they are affected by trespass or nuisance from a construction project? I imagine they can complain, but can they do more than that?
Well, depending on the situation, they could potentially take legal action to stop the activity, or they could seek compensation for any harm that's been caused.
So construction companies really need to be mindful of their impact on neighboring properties during their projects.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about building responsibly and respecting the rights of others.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Wow, you've really painted a picture of how many legal considerations there are around construction sites. It seems like every step of the way is governed by some kind of law or regulation.
Well, yeah, I think it's important to remember that these legal frameworks are in place to protect everyone involved, the workers, the community, and the environment.
Right, that makes sense. So we've laid a good foundation for understanding the legal side of things when it comes to construction. Now I'm really interested in digging into the actual buying, selling, and leasing of the property itself. how do all of these legal concepts we've been talking about actually play into those transactions?
All right, so that's where we really get into the nitty-gritty of how contract law and land law interact to govern property transactions.
I have a feeling those two are going to be recurring characters in this story.
Oh, they definitely are.
So before we went to, I guess they weren't really a break, but before we moved on to this section, we were talking about all the legal stuff around construction, like planning permission, those building regulations, all that. But now I'm kind of curious about the actual buying and selling and leasing of the property itself.
Right.
How does all that stuff we were just talking about, how does it all play into those kinds of transactions?
Okay, so this is where we really see how contract law and land law work together to, well, they basically govern these transactions.
You mentioned before that you can't really have one without the other.
Right.
Can you kind of explain what you meant by that?
Sure. Let's start with buying and selling. So imagine you want to buy a piece of land. Well, you and the seller, you need a contract. You need a legally binding agreement that outlines all the terms of the sale. And that's where contract law comes in.
So the contract is basically setting the ground rules for the entire transaction.
Exactly. It covers all the important stuff, like the purchase price, the boundaries of the property, and any conditions that need to be met before the sale is finalized. But it's not just about creating a contract. It's also about making sure that the transfer of ownership from the seller to the buyer, that's all legally sound, and that's where land law comes into play.
So land law is like the framework for property ownership.
Yeah, pretty much. Land law deals with things like registering the transfer of ownership with the land registry, making sure the legal title is clear, there are no issues with it, and also dealing with any existing rights or restrictions on the property.
So it's kind of a two-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Contract law is for the agreement itself, and land law makes sure the transfer of ownership is all done correctly.
You got it. And this interplay between the two, it's crucial when you're talking about leasing land and buildings as well.
Okay, so let's talk about leases for a minute. How does the law work differently when someone is renting a property rather than buying it?
Well, when you lease a property, you're not buying it outright. You're getting the right to occupy and use it for a certain period of time. And this right is given through a lease agreement, which is also a contract.
So contract law is still the basis of the agreement.
Exactly. The lease agreement, it lays out all the terms of the lease, things like how much rent you'll pay, how long the lease will last, who's responsible, if something needs to be repaired, that sort of thing. But just like with buying and selling, land law plays a really important role in making sure the lease is, well, legally sound.
So what kind of things in land law are relevant to leases specifically?
Land law helps define the legal relationship between the landlord, who owns the property, and the tenant, who has the right to use it. It covers things like registering the lease, making it official, enforcing the terms of the lease, and figuring out what to do if there are disputes between the landlord and the tenant.
Okay, so it sounds like both contracts law and land law are really important for creating a secure and legally sound framework for both selling and leasing property.
Exactly. They both work to protect the rights and interests of everyone involved in these transactions.
Okay, so we've established that these two areas of law are kind of intertwined in all these property transactions, but I'm wondering if you can give us some specific examples of how this actually plays out in the real world.
Okay, sure. Let's say we have a developer who wants to build a new shopping center. First thing they need to do is, well, they need to acquire the land for the project. So that means they'll have to negotiate and enter into contracts with the landowners.
So that's where contract law comes in.
Yeah, to secure the land for the development. The contract's going to specify the purchase price, how they're going to pay for it, and any conditions that have to be met before the sale is finalized. But the developer also has to think about the land law side of things. Like, are there any easements or covenants on the land that might affect what they can build?
Oh, right. Those easements and covenants we talked about before.
Yeah.
Those can really complicate things.
You can. The developer really needs to make sure they understand any rights or restrictions on the land before they sign on the dotted line, before they commit to buying it.
Okay, so let's say the developer has done their due diligence and they've secured the land, taking both contract law and land law into account. What happens next?
Well, now the developer needs to think about leasing out all those retail spaces in the shopping center. They'll need to draw up lease agreements for each tenant, agreements that clearly outline all the terms and conditions.
So contract law is back in the picture again when it comes to these lease agreements.
Absolutely. The lease agreements will have things like the amount of rent, the length of the lease, who's responsible for repairs, and any limitations on how the tenant can use the space. But again, land law is important here too.
In what way?
Well, land law helps make sure those lease agreements are actually legally enforceable. It also covers things like registering the leases, outlining the landlord's right to, come onto the property, and figuring out what happens if a tenant breaks the rules if they violate the terms of the lease agreement.
So it's really fascinating how both contract law and land law work together in these pretty complex transactions.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. They provide a really comprehensive framework that basically governs the whole life cycle of a property development,
Mhm.
from acquiring the land to leasing out the finished spaces.
Okay, so we've talked about how these legal concepts apply to buying and selling and leasing, but what about when things go wrong?
Right.
What about when disputes arise? How does the law help resolve those conflicts in property transactions?
Well, disputes can happen for lots of reasons, like disagreements over the terms of a contract, arguments about boundaries, or someone breaks the terms of a lease. Both contract law and land law have ways to resolve these conflicts.
What kind of ways?
For example, let's say there's a contract dispute. The parties might try mediation or arbitration. Those are ways to settle things outside of court.
Okay.
Or if those don't work, they might have to go to court, which would be litigation.
Yeah.
Land law also has specific remedies for certain situations. Like, for example, if someone is encroaching on your property, you could ask for an injunction to try and stop them.
So there's a whole bunch of options depending on what the dispute is all about.
Yeah, and it's always a good idea to talk to a lawyer if you're having a property dispute,
Right.
because they can help you understand your rights and figure out the best way to handle the situation.
You've really shown how important both contract law and land law are for making sure property transactions go smoothly and that everything is done legally. But before we move on, can you tell us a little about, well, how did we get here? How did these legal concepts develop over time? You mentioned that they have a long history.
Oh, yeah, they do. The idea of land ownership and having agreements about land use, that goes back centuries.
Mm.
In England and Wales, the system we have today, it's evolved over a really long time. It's been influenced by, well, all sorts of things, different historical periods, legal developments.
Can you walk us through some of that history?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, let's go back in time a bit. We can start with the feudal system, that thing that dominated England for ages after the Norman conquest back in 1066.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that in school. Wasn't it all about knights and castles and stuff?
Well, yeah, that was part of it, but it also had a huge impact on how land was owned and used. Under feudalism, the king, he owned all the land, and he would grant it to lords in exchange for their loyalty and, military support if he needed it.
So it was a very top-down system. The king was in charge of everything.
Exactly. And then the lords, they would in turn grant portions of their land to lesser nobles or to tenants, and they'd get rent or labor in return. It was a very complex system with all these obligations and rights tied to the land.
It sounds like the beginnings of land law as we know it.
Yeah, you could say that. Feudalism really established this idea of different levels of ownership and control over land. As feudalism started to decline, you see the emergence of more individualistic ideas about property rights.
So people started owning land directly?
Exactly. And the development of common law, which is based on judicial precedents, court decisions, that also had a big influence on how land law developed. Courts started to recognize and enforce agreements about land, which really laid the foundation for modern contract law.
So things started to become more official, more formalized.
Right. And then there was a really important moment back in 1677. That's when the Statute of Frauds was passed. This law required certain types of contracts, including those for land, to be in writing. That really helped prevent fraud and made property transactions much more, well, certain.
Yeah, I can see how that would be important. A written contract is a lot harder to dispute than just a verbal agreement.
Exactly. And over the centuries, there were many other legal reforms that refined the system even more, which eventually led to the concepts we have today: freehold and leasehold ownership, the systems for registering land, and a whole body of law that's specifically about property transactions.
So the system we have today is really the result of centuries of, well, legal evolution.
It is. It's a really interesting mix of historical influences and, this ongoing effort to try to create a legal framework for land ownership and transactions that is fair and transparent.
It really makes you realize just how complex these areas of law are when you see how they developed over time.
It does. And it's important to remember that the law is always changing. It's always evolving to keep up with, the needs of society.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the basic principles of contract and land law to their real-world applications to their historical development.
Yeah, we've seen how these two areas of law work together to make sure transactions run smoothly, to protect everyone's rights, and to resolve disputes fairly.
And we've also learned about the long and fascinating history of these concepts and how they've shaped the way we think about property and land today.
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and that you'll continue exploring the world of construction law.